my God, what is happening to you, son?
A widow adopted a dying homeless boy. Years later, he returned as a billionaire. She knelt beside him, just in time to feel how cold his body had become. Not just any homeless boy, someone else's child, abandoned by the world. A boy the doctors said wouldn't last the night, and no one was willing to claim. She wasn't supposed to stop that evening. She had already buried her husband, already learned how fragile love could be. But something in the boy's eyes made her stay. Watching, waiting, choosing. She thought she was only giving him a place to die with dignity. A name. A warm bed. A hand to hold when the pain came. She never imagined he would live. Now years have passed, and the woman who once had nothing left to give hears a knock at her door. A convoy outside. Men in suits. And a stranger who looks at her like she saved his entire life. Because he isn't just a visitor. He's the boy she adopted when no one else would. And the secret he brings back will change her life forever. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Ocean of Tales. Kindly like, comment, and subscribe on this channel. We will be grateful if you help us do this. We will be notifying you when we drop a new video. Don't forget to tell us where you're watching from. Rain slid down the street in thin silver lines, soaking cardboard boxes and broken dreams, while a boy lay curled near a shuttered shop, his breath shallow and uneven. Streetlights flickered like they were unsure whether to stay on, and shoes passed him without slowing, splashing water onto his thin shirt. Somewhere nearby, a bus hissed and pulled away, carrying warmth and people who still believed tomorrow belonged to them. The boy's eyes fluttered open, unfocused, searching for something that never came. The cold crept deeper into his bones, and for a moment, even the night seemed ready to let him go, but then footsteps stopped. A woman stood at the edge of the light, grocery bag cutting into her fingers, rain darkening the hem of her dress. She had already walked too far to pretend she hadn't seen him, already felt that familiar ache she tried to silence every day since her husband died. Her chest tightened as she looked down, not in panic, not in heroism, but in quiet exhaustion. She had learned how easy it was to keep moving, how survival often meant not feeling. But the boy shifted weakly, and something in the sound pulled her backward into grief she thought she had buried, forcing her feet to stay rooted. She knelt slowly, knees pressing into wet concrete, the cold seeping through her skin as she reached out. His body was lighter than it should have been, almost unreal, like he had already started fading. She felt the chill under her palm and flinched, not from the temperature, but from the truth settling in her stomach. This wasn't someone resting. This was someone slipping. The air smelled of rain and rust and something final. Her throat tightened as she realized no one else was coming. Not tonight, not ever, and the weight of that reality pressed harder than the rain. Traffic murmured in the distance, indifferent and constant, while the boy's breath stuttered again, thinner this time. The woman looked up once, half hoping someone would intervene, half afraid they would tell her to move along. No one did. Windows stayed dark. Doors stayed shut. The city had already decided. She swallowed, fingers trembling as she brushed damp hair from the boy's forehead, her heart pounding with a fear she refused to name. Because naming it would mean accepting what she might have to do next. She reached for her phone, not to call for help she no longer trusted to arrive, but to check the time, as if it mattered. Night had already crossed into morning somewhere else. The world was still spinning. Her life, however, had narrowed to this single moment, this single choice. Leave, and she would survive like everyone else. Stay, and everything she had carefully rebuilt since the funeral might crack open again. The rain intensified, drumming against the ground like a countdown, daring her to decide. Carefully, she slipped off her cardigan and wrapped it around his thin shoulders, the fabric instantly soaking through. His eyes opened wider then, meeting hers for half a second, confusion flickering into something like relief. That look hit harder than any scream could have. She felt it settle in her chest, heavy and irreversible. This was no longer about kindness. This was about who she would be when she stood up again, or whether she would stand up at all. She gathered him into her arms, surprised by how easily he fit, surprised by how fast her heart accepted the weight. Water soaked her clothes, chilled her skin, and blurred the street into streaks of light as she stood. Each step felt louder than it should have, as if the city itself were watching now, finally curious. She didn't know where she was going yet, only that she was moving towards something she couldn't undo, and the question lingered with every step. Was she carrying a boy who would live, or one she would soon have to bury? Water dripped from her hair onto the floor as she pushed open her front door, the boy's weight still light in her arms, but somehow heavier in her spirit. The room smelled of damp cement and yesterday's silence, the kind of silence that had lived with her ever since the funeral. She kicked the door shut with her heel and stood still, listening to the boy's uneven breathing like it was a fragile clock counting down. The small bulb in the ceiling flickered once, then steadied, throwing a harsh glow over her plain furniture. She realized she had brought death into her house, and she didn't know if her home could survive that. She lowered him onto the worn sofa, with hands that tried to be gentle but moved like panic. Her eyes scanned his ribs, his cracked lips, the bruises that looked old, the scars that looked older, and she felt anger rise at people she couldn't even name. Her husband had died slowly too, in hospitals that felt like cold machines, and she had watched helplessly while bills stacked up and sympathy dried out. Now her body remembered that helplessness, and it made her hands shake as she reached for water, for cloth, for anything that could turn this nightmare into something she could control. She rushed to her small kitchen, yanking open cupboards that mostly held emptiness, and the sound of clattering plates echoed like accusation. She measured her savings the way poor people do, by memory, by fear, by what might break you if you spend it. She had promised herself never again. Never again would she throw money into hope and watch it die. Never again would she risk everything for a life the world had already stamped finished. But as she returned to the sofa and saw the boy's eyelids flutter, she felt that promise wobble, as if her grief itself was begging to be challenged. She grabbed her phone again, thumb hovering over contacts she rarely used, because every call in her life had started to feel like debt. The screen lit up her face, showing lines grief had carved into her skin. She imagined the questions people would ask, the judgment that would follow, the way neighbors loved stories more than they loved truth. She imagined someone saying the boy was a trap, a scam, a spiritual problem, a stain on her name. Then she imagined herself walking past him earlier, leaving him there to fade, and the shame of that picture hit her harder than any gossip ever could. She lifted him and carried him toward her bedroom, each step slow, careful, like she was walking across glass. The room held her husband's old shirt folded on a chair, untouched, still smelling faintly of soap and memory. Her throat tightened as she laid the boy on her bed, the same bed she had cried in for months, the same mattress that had held her when she thought she would never feel warmth again. The boy's breathing rattled, weak and stubborn, and she realized this wasn't just a rescue. This was a collision between her past pain and a new suffering that refused to stay outside her door. She moved fast, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead, wiping grime from his cheeks, trying to make him look like a child again instead of a forgotten thing. Her hands were mother hands without a child, hands that had once dreamed of rocking a baby but instead rocked a dying husband. Her stomach twisted as she felt something dangerous rise inside her, attachment. That was the real risk. Not the money. Not the rumors. Attachment was what could destroy her if this boy slipped away in her house. And yet, as she watched his chest rise and fall, she felt herself leaning in anyway, like she was choosing heartbreak on purpose. She stepped back, breathing hard, and stared at the boy the way people stare at storms coming toward them, knowing they can't outrun it. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, shaking the window slightly, and she wondered if the universe was warning her to stop. But she had already stopped. She had already carried him across the line. Now the question wasn't whether she could save him. It was whether saving him would expose the part of her that never healed after her husband died, the part she kept hidden just to survive, and what would happen if that part finally broke open. Morning light crept into the room like an intruder, pale and uncertain, revealing the boy's condition without mercy. His chest rose in shallow jerks, each breath sounding like it had to fight its way out. The widow stood over him, sleepless, her eyes burning from a night spent counting every inhale like it was borrowed time. When she touched his forehead again, the heat startled her, sharp and wrong. The room smelled of damp cloth and fear. This was no longer about shelter or kindness. This was sickness. And sickness had rules she had already lost to once. The hospital corridor echoed with footsteps and murmurs as she pushed through its doors, the boy wrapped tightly in her arms like fragile cargo. White walls, harsh lights, disinfectant in the air, it all came rushing back too fast. Her stomach clenched with memories she didn't invite. Nurses moved efficiently, barely looking at her face, barely looking at the boy as if they already knew how this story ended. She felt herself shrinking, becoming that woman again. The one waiting for bad news, the one whose hope always arrived too late. Doctors gathered around the bed, eyes flicking between charts and the boy's thin body. Their movements were careful, practiced, distant. The widow watched their expressions harden into something polite but final. She didn't need words to understand what they were thinking. He was malnourished. His organs were stressed. Infection had settled in too deeply. Survival was unlikely. Their voices carried no cruelty, only certainty. And certainty, she knew, could be more devastating than cruelty ever was. Outside the ward, whispers followed her like shadows. People glanced at her with that familiar mix of pity and curiosity, already shaping a story they would later retell. Why would a widow bring in a homeless child? Where did she find him? Was she trying to prove something? She felt judged without being accused, dismissed without being spoken to. In that space between the hospital walls, she realized something bitter and clear. The world had already decided this boy's value, and it was low enough to let him go quietly. She sat beside his bed, the plastic chair cold against her legs, listening to machines hum softly, like they were waiting too. The boy's face looked smaller under the bright lights, his eyelashes too long for someone who had suffered so much. She reached for his hand, half expecting it to pull away, but his fingers curled weakly around hers instead. That tiny grip felt heavier than any diagnosis. It wasn't gratitude. It wasn't hope. It was instinct, the instinct to hold on when everything else is slipping. The doctors returned with paperwork, their tone careful, almost apologetic. They spoke of options that weren't really options, of time frames that felt like countdowns. She nodded because that's what people do when they're being told not to expect miracles. Inside, something tightened. She had buried her husband after believing medicine would save him. She had stood by bedsides long enough to know when professionals stopped fighting. And now they were asking her to prepare for goodbye again, before she had even said hello. As she signed forms with a hand that didn't feel like her own, a thought settled deep in her chest, quiet but dangerous. If everyone else had already given up, if survival was no longer expected, then loving this boy could no longer make things worse. The worst had already been predicted. She looked through the glass at his still body and felt resolve replace fear, slow and steady. If the world insisted he would not live, then the only question left was what kind of love he would feel before the end, and whether love alone could still rewrite what everyone else was so sure of. Morning arrived softly this time, light sliding through thin curtains and settling on the boy's face, as if testing whether he was still there. The widow moved quietly around the room, afraid sudden noise might shatter whatever fragile balance had kept him breathing through the night. The house creaked with age, every sound amplified in the hush, and the air carried the faint smell of boiled herbs and damp sheets. She paused beside him, watching his chest rise and fall, slower now, steadier, but still uncertain enough to make her heart hold its breath. She rearranged her days around him without announcing it to herself, waking before dawn to check his temperature, measuring time in spoonfuls of soup and folded cloths. The routines were small, almost invisible, but they stitched her hours together again. She spoke his name often, testing how it sounded in the room, letting it fill corners once occupied by grief. Each time she said it, something inside her softened. The boy stirred sometimes, eyes fluttering open briefly, as if learning the shape of safety one breath at a time. A night, she slept on the floor beside the bed, her back aching, her dreams shallow and restless. She listened for changes in his breathing, counting the seconds between each rise of his chest. The house felt different then, less hollow, more alert, as if it, too, had decided to keep watch. Rain tapped gently on the roof, and the quiet no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like waiting. And waiting, she realized, was not the same as giving up. His body resisted healing at first, fighting every attempt at nourishment like it didn't trust kindness anymore. She learned patience the hard way, through spills, through nausea, through moments when his eyes filled with fear at the simplest touch. She adjusted, slowed down, learned to move at his pace instead of forcing improvement. The progress was barely visible, but it was there. In a steadier pulse, in fingers that clenched less tightly in pain, in breaths that no longer sounded like surrender. The house became a map of quiet victories. A bowl left empty. A night passed without fever. A cough that didn't last as long as the one before. She marked these moments silently, afraid to celebrate too loudly in case hope overheard and disappeared again. Her own body responded too, sleep returning in fragments, appetite creeping back, laughter almost forming before she caught herself. Healing, she realized, was contagious, spreading in both directions whether she invited it or not. Neighbors passed by sometimes, slowing near her gate, curiosity hanging thick in the air. She felt their presence like pressure on her skin, but she kept her focus inside, on the boy, on the rhythm they were building together. The outside world felt loud and careless compared to the fragile order growing in her home. She chose not to explain, not to defend. Love, she was learning, did not require witnesses to be real. One afternoon, as sunlight pooled warmly on the floor, the boy opened his eyes fully and held them open, looking around like someone arriving in a place he hadn't expected to reach. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither of them moved. The widow felt something settle deep in her chest, not relief, not victory, but recognition. This was no longer a borrowed moment. This was a beginning. And with that realization came a new fear, sharper than before. If love had brought him back this far, how much more could it demand from her next? Morning sounds drifted in from outside, the scrape of sandals on concrete, a radio humming somewhere nearby, voices rising and falling like gossip finding its rhythm. The widow noticed it first in the way footsteps slowed near her gate, in the sudden hush that followed when she stepped outside to fetch water. Eyes lingered longer than before. Smiles came late, if at all. She felt the shift without a single word being spoken, the way a place can turn unfamiliar even when nothing has physically changed, and she sensed that her quiet act of kindness had begun to make people uncomfortable. Questions arrived disguised as concern, floating through the air without ever landing directly on her. People wondered aloud why a woman alone would take in a child with no family, no history anyone respected. They speculated about motives they couldn't understand, inventing reasons because kindness without benefit made no sense to them. She heard her name whispered in passing, paired with theories that grew sharper by the day. Each rumor carried the same message, that love, when it didn't follow social rules, was something to be suspicious of. She moved through the market with her head high, but her body felt the weight of every stare. Vendors paused mid-transaction when she approached, curiosity edging out courtesy. Some offered pity disguised as advice, warning her about curses, bad luck, and children who bring trouble into a home. Others simply watched, waiting for proof that she would regret her choice. She said little, letting their words slide past her like dust, but inside, anger and resolve twisted together, refusing to let her retreat. Back at home, the boy sensed the tension even when she tried to hide it. He watched her closely, eyes following her movements, absorbing the atmosphere the way children always do. When voices rose outside, his shoulders stiffened. When footsteps stopped near the gate, His breathing quickened. She noticed how quickly fear had learned to live in him, how easily it returned. That realization cut deeper than the gossip itself, because it meant the world was still trying to take something from him, this time through her. She closed the door more often now, choosing isolation over explanation. The house became a boundary, separating safety from judgment. Inside, routines continued quietly, but the air felt heavier, charged with the knowledge that love had made them visible. She wondered how long she could shield him from what people said, how long before curiosity turned cruel. The cost of being different was no longer abstract. It was pressing against her walls, testing her endurance. At night, she lay awake listening to the sounds outside, measuring them against the boy's breathing beside her. Doubt crept in during those hours, whispering that life would be easier if she conformed, if she let go before attachment deepened further. But each time that thought surfaced, another followed quickly behind it, the image of him alone in the cold, invisible and forgotten. That memory hardened her resolve, even as it made her chest ache. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the yard, laughter drifted from nearby, sharp and careless. The widow stood at the window, watching silhouettes move past her home like they belonged somewhere else. She felt the distance growing, a quiet exile shaped by judgment and envy. Yet as she turned back toward the boy, now resting more peacefully than before, she understood the trade she had made. Acceptance from others had been replaced with something far more fragile and far more dangerous to lose, and the question lingered with her in the dim light. How much more would the world demand in exchange for allowing them to keep it? Sunlight cut sharply through the window one morning, landing on the boy's face with a brightness that made him squint instead of flinch. The widow noticed it immediately. The way his eyes adjusted, the way his chest lifted without struggle. Something had shifted. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but undeniably. His body no longer looked like it was retreating from life. It looked like it was bracing itself for it. That realization sent a quiet tremor through her, because surviving was no longer the miracle. Wanting to live was. He began to sit up on his own, slow and careful, as if testing whether the world would punish him for trying. Each movement cost him effort, and sweat gathered at his temples. But he didn't stop. Pain crossed his face, then passed, replaced by focus. The widow watched from the doorway, heart racing, resisting the urge to rush in and protect him from discomfort. She understood, instinctively, that this struggle belonged to him. This was his fight now, and interference, no matter how loving, might steal something he needed to claim for himself. Hunger returned next, not the desperate, hollow hunger of the streets, but something sharper and more demanding. He asked for food more often, eyes following her movements with intensity. She noticed how carefully he ate, how nothing was wasted, how gratitude and fear sat side by side in every bite. Survival had taught him discipline long before comfort ever did. That discipline hardened quietly into resolve, and resolve into something that looked dangerously like ambition. The boy started asking questions, not out of curiosity, but out of strategy. How things worked, why people behaved the way they did, why some homes felt safe and others didn't. He listened more than he spoke, absorbing lessons from silence as much as from answers. The widow sensed his mind stretching, reaching beyond the limits of his body, refusing to be confined by what he had been. Each question widened the gap between the boy the world had abandoned and the person he was becoming. At night, he stared at the ceiling instead of sleeping, jaw set, eyes burning with thoughts too heavy for a child his age. The widow felt it when she passed his door. The pressure of a mind replaying pain, rewriting it, reshaping it into fuel. This was no longer just healing. This was transformation. And with it came fear, because she knew pain, once sharpened into purpose, could build empires or destroy souls. One afternoon, she found him standing in the yard, unsteady but determined, practicing steps like each one was a declaration. He stumbled, caught himself, then continued, refusing help. Dust clung to his feet, sweat darkened his shirt, and his breathing came hard, but his eyes held something new. Defiance. Not toward her. Toward fate itself. He had been counted out too early, and he was keeping score. As she watched him push forward, a quiet realization settled over her, heavier than any diagnosis. Saving him had been the first miracle. What he chose to become would be the second, and she had no control over it. The boy who refused to die was no longer content with survival. He was reaching for something bigger, something sharper, something that would one day force the world to look back at him. And when that day came, she wondered, would it recognize the cost of what it had almost lost? Time began to move differently after that, no longer measured by fevers or breaths, but by seasons quietly stacking on top of each other. The widow woke one morning to a house that felt fuller than it ever had, yet already prepared for emptiness. The boy had grown taller, stronger, more self-contained, his presence filling rooms even when he said nothing. School bags replaced medicine bottles. Shoes lined the doorway, where once there had only been fear. And still, beneath the ordinary rhythm, she sensed something loosening, like a knot slowly preparing to come undone. The day he left arrived without ceremony, disguised as progress. Morning light poured into the room as she folded his clothes with care, smoothing wrinkles she didn't need to fix. His future waited beyond her walls. Education, opportunity, a world that suddenly wanted him now that he could offer something back. She packed food he might not eat and notes he might not read, delaying the moment with small, practical movements. Every step toward the door felt like rehearsal for a loss she had already survived once before. The gate closed behind him with a sound that echoed longer than it should have. The street swallowed him quickly, the way it always did, and she stood there long after his figure disappeared, listening to life continue without pause. Cars passed. Neighbors talked. Somewhere, laughter rose and fell. The world did not mark the moment, but inside her, something shifted painfully quiet. She returned to a house that still held his imprint, his scent, his footsteps, the space his voice used to occupy, and wondered how absence could feel so loud. Days turned into months, then years, stitched together by routine and restraint. She did not call. She did not ask. Love, she believed, should never demand proof. She learned to sit with uncertainty, to live without updates, to trust that whatever she had given him had already done its work. Some nights, doubt crept in, whispering that she had been foolish to let him go so easily. Other nights, pride stood taller, reminding her that survival had never been meant to end at her doorstep. The community moved on in predictable ways, finding new stories to tell, new lives to examine. Her name faded from conversation, replaced by fresher gossip. People no longer slowed at her gate. Curiosity dissolved into indifference. To them, the boy had been a phase, a strange chapter best forgotten. She watched this erasure quietly, aware that something precious was being underestimated again, but this time, she didn't feel the urge to correct anyone. Her own life settled into modest stability. Work filled her days. Evenings stretched long and quiet. She tended her home carefully, as if preserving it for someone who might never return. Sometimes she caught herself setting aside food out of habit, then stopped, smiling sadly at the reflex. Hope no longer burned bright in her chest. It rested deeper now, calmer, shaped by patience instead of expectation. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in muted colors, she sat alone on her porch, listening to distant sounds carry through the air. Years had taught her how to survive silence, but not how to predict what it was preparing her for. Somewhere far away, a life she had touched was unfolding beyond her sight, growing heavier with consequence. And as she rose to close her door for the night, unaware of how close the future truly was, a question lingered softly in the quiet. When silence finally breaks, will it return what she gave, or demand something entirely new? The sound came first, low and unfamiliar, rolling down the street like a warning the neighborhood wasn't prepared for. The widow looked up from where she stood rinsing vegetables, water dripping from her fingers as the hum grew louder, heavier, layered with purpose. It wasn't the sound of daily life. It wasn't the careless noise of passing traffic. This was deliberate, controlled. She stepped toward the window just as sunlight flashed off dark vehicles easing into the narrow road, their engines quiet but commanding, bending attention in their direction without asking permission. People emerged slowly, curiosity pulling them from doorways and shops like gravity. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. Heads turned in unison. The convoy stopped with precision outside her gate, polished doors opening almost in sync, revealing men in tailored suits who didn't look lost, confused, or apologetic. They stood still, scanning the surroundings with eyes trained to assess value and threat. The street felt smaller suddenly, pressed in by a presence that didn't belong to it. The widow's pulse quickened, not with fear, but with a strange sense of displacement. Like reality had shifted without warning, she wiped her hands on her dress and stepped outside, the afternoon air suddenly too warm against her skin. A man broke from the group and walked toward her, his posture confident, his expression carefully neutral. She searched his face for clues, for recognition, for anything that explained why her quiet life had been interrupted so abruptly. Then she saw his eyes. The world narrowed to that detail alone. The shape of them, the intensity, the way they held memory like a flame that refused to die. Time folded in on itself as he stopped a few feet away. The years peeled back without asking permission, revealing the boy she once carried through rain, the child who clung to life with stubborn defiance. The man standing before her was taller, broader, composed in ways the boy had never been, but the look was the same. Recognition landed not as joy, but as shock so sharp it stole her breath. The street, the people, the convoy faded into background noise as something unspoken passed between them. The men behind him shifted subtly, watching closely, sensing importance, without understanding it. Neighbors leaned forward, whispers beginning to ripple outward like cracks in glass. The widow felt suddenly exposed, standing at the center of a moment she hadn't prepared for. She searched his face for reassurance, for explanation, for confirmation that this wasn't a mistake. Instead, she saw emotion restrained with discipline, gratitude held back by years of control. He reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, and for a split second, tension tightened the air. Then he pulled out nothing threatening at all, just a folded piece of worn fabric, softened by time. Her breath caught as she recognized it instantly. The cardigan she had wrapped around a dying boy on a cold night, preserved when everything else had changed. The sight of it struck deeper than words ever could, unlocking memories she had locked away for survival. The street erupted softly with murmurs, confusion spreading as understanding lagged behind spectacle. But for the widow, the world had already tilted beyond repair. This was no visitor.
No stranger.
This was consequence. This was return. And as she stared at the man shaped by her quiet decision, a single, unsettling realization took hold. Whatever he had come back to give or take would not be small, and the life she had rebuilt in silence was about to be tested by a truth far larger than she was ready to face. The man stepped past the gate with ease, as if the space had always belonged to him, and the street seemed to exhale without understanding why. The widow followed him inside, her movements slow, careful, like she was walking through a memory instead of her own home. The men in suits remained outside, forming a quiet perimeter that turned her modest house into the center of something powerful. Inside, the air felt thicker, charged with history, as sunlight traced familiar paths across walls that had once held fear, sickness, and hope in equal measure. He stood in the middle of the room, taking it in with eyes that missed nothing. The worn sofa, the patched curtains, the narrow hallway where he had once learned to walk again, step by painful step. His fingers brushed the back of a chair unconsciously, as if grounding himself in proof that this place was real. Wealth had refined his posture, sharpened his confidence, but it had not erased the imprint of this house on his body. This was not nostalgia. This was origin. The widow watched him closely, noticing how controlled his breathing was, how carefully he kept emotion behind his eyes. She sensed that what stood before her had been built deliberately, layer by layer, with discipline forged in pain. His success was not loud. It was dense. The kind of success that comes from never forgetting hunger, from remembering what it feels like to be invisible. She realized then that whatever empire he commanded had been shaped less by opportunity and more by memory. Images surfaced uninvited. The boy studying late into the night, the way he listened instead of spoke, how he measured people before trusting them. Those traits had not been accidents. They were survival strategies sharpened into tools. Education had given him language. Money had given him reach. But suffering had given him direction. He had not escaped his past. He had carried it forward, using it as a compass when others used comfort. He moved toward the window, looking out at the street where his life had nearly ended. Cars passed without slowing, just as they had years ago. The symmetry was not lost on him. Power, she understood now, had not erased his memory of abandonment. It had amplified it. Every decision he made was filtered through that night, through the woman who stopped when the world did not. His wealth was not his victory. It was his instrument. The widow felt a tightness in her chest, not pride, not fear, but a sober clarity. This was no fairy tale ending where money erased pain. This was something heavier, something earned. The boy she had saved had not grown into a man seeking applause. He had grown into someone measuring debt, obligation, and legacy. And suddenly, she understood that his return was not just about gratitude. It was about alignment, about placing the past where it truly belonged. As the weight of that realization settled, a new tension rose quietly between them, unspoken but undeniable. Because power, once acknowledged, demands response. And whatever he had built in silence was now standing inside her home, ready to intersect with her life in ways neither of them had rehearsed. The question no longer hovered around who he had become, but what his return would require of her, now that the truth behind the billionaire was no longer hidden. The street looked the same, but it no longer behaved the same. Neighbors who once walked past her gate without slowing now lingered at a careful distance, pretending to be busy while watching everything unfold. Their voices dropped into whispers, their expressions shifting from curiosity to discomfort as understanding began to catch up with spectacle. The widow noticed how quickly attention rewrites memory, how people suddenly struggled to recall the harsh things they had once said when power stood too close to ignore. The men in suits moved with quiet authority, their presence turning ordinary space into something official, something final. Doors opened wider than usual. Greetings came faster, sweeter, rehearsed. Faces that once carried suspicion now wore admiration without apology. The widow watched it all with a calm that surprised her. Years of quiet endurance had hardened her against sudden approval. She recognized the pattern instantly. Judgment retreating in the face of consequence, shame hiding behind politeness. Someone laughed nervously nearby, trying to lighten the tension, but the sound landed wrong, too sharp against the stillness. A woman who had once warned her about bad luck now nodded eagerly, eyes darting between the convoy and the widow's door. Men who had whispered theories now stood straighter, as if proximity alone might cleanse them of their earlier certainty. The shift was almost physical, like a tide reversing without warning. The widow felt none of the satisfaction people imagine comes with vindication. There was no urge to confront, no hunger to expose. What she felt instead was clarity. Every look, every sudden kindness confirmed what she had always known, that judgment had never been about concern. It had been about comfort, about protecting a worldview where suffering stayed neatly out of sight and kindness came with conditions. Inside her home, the man watched through the window, seeing the same people through a different lens. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition. He had learned long ago how quickly respect follows power, how fast morality bends when status enters the room. This was not new to him. It was confirmation. And confirmation, he knew, was more dangerous than ignorance because it removed any remaining illusions. The widow stepped forward, opening her gate wider than before, not as invitation, but as declaration. She did not hide. She did not explain. She stood exactly where she had always stood, unmoved by approval, untouched by regret. The street quieted in response, as if unsure how to behave without a script. Judgment had met reality, and reality did not flinch. As the moment stretched, something subtle but irreversible settled over the neighborhood. The story they had told themselves no longer fit. The widow was no longer an object of pity or suspicion. The boy was no longer a footnote. And as people slowly retreated, carrying their discomfort with them, one truth lingered in the air. Justice had arrived without shouting, and its silence made it impossible to escape. The shift began quietly, without speeches or announcements, the way real change often does. The man stepped back into the house with the widow, closing the door gently behind them, shutting out the restless curiosity still buzzing outside. Inside, the space felt smaller now, not because it had changed, but because something vast had entered it. He moved through the room with intention, as if every corner mattered, as if every crack in the wall held meaning. This was not charity. This was acknowledgement. Papers appeared next, placed carefully on the table like fragile truths. Not contracts dripping with control, not gifts meant to overwhelm, but plans, thought out, deliberate, rooted in memory. Shelters where forgotten children would be treated like futures instead of burdens. Clinics built where people once died quietly, without names. Scholarships that carried no publicity, only possibility. The widow felt the weight of it not as excess, but as purpose shaped by restraint. This was wealth that remembered where it came from. The man's attention kept returning to her, not with obligation, but with reverence. He watched her hands as she read, noting how they trembled, not from greed or disbelief, but from recognition. Everything he had built pointed back to a single moment of compassion she had never meant to turn into legacy. He understood something many never do. Money can amplify kindness, but it cannot create it. That had been her gift alone. Outside, the neighborhood felt the ripple before it understood the source. Jobs appeared where none had existed. Repairs happened without begging. Doors once closed began to open, not because people had changed, but because opportunity had arrived wearing consequence. The widow observed these changes with a quiet steadiness, aware that transformation does not erase memory, it rearranges it. The same people who once doubted now benefited from a kindness they had questioned. The man visited the places others avoided, the shelters, the corners, the forgotten streets, with a familiarity that unsettled people who expected distance. He did not look away from suffering. He measured it. He invested in it. Every decision echoed a lesson learned on the floor of a cold street, wrapped in a stranger's cardigan. This was not generosity driven by guilt. It was strategy informed by gratitude. The widow felt her life stretching again, not pulled by loss this time, but by meaning. She did not move into luxury. She did not change her routines. What changed was scale. Her quiet choices now traveled further than she ever imagined. She had not raised a savior. She had raised a reminder that dignity multiplies when protected early. As she stood watching him leave once more, not disappearing this time but expanding outward into the world, she understood the full shape of what had been built. Not a fortune, not a reputation, a lineage of compassion that would outlive both of them. And in that realization came one final, humbling truth: love, when given freely, does not return as repayment. It returns as responsibility. The house grew quiet again after the cars left, the kind of quiet that settles gently instead of pressing down. The widow moved through her room slowly, touching familiar surfaces, as if confirming they were still real. The chair by the window, the worn table, the doorway where fear had once stood breathing hard. Nothing glittered. Nothing demanded attention. Yet the air felt different, lighter, fuller, like a long-held breath had finally been released, and something unseen had chosen to stay. She sat alone as evening folded into night, listening to distant sounds drift through open windows. Somewhere, children laughed. Somewhere else, engines hummed toward futures she would never witness. Her life had not been rewritten into spectacle, and she felt grateful for that. What had changed was quieter and far more permanent. A single moment of compassion had outlived hunger, gossip, doubt, and even time itself. The thought settled in her chest like warmth instead of pride. Memories surfaced, without pain now. The cold street, the weight of a fragile body, the fear of loving something that might be lost. She realized then that the risk had never been the boy dying in her care. The real risk would have been letting him die unseen. That understanding softened every regret she had ever carried. Loss, she understood at last, had not hollowed her life. It had prepared it. Outside, the world continued with its noise and urgency, unaware of how quietly it had been changed. People would benefit without knowing why. Children would sleep warmer without learning her name. Futures would bend away from despair without ever tracing the line back to her door. That anonymity felt right. True kindness, she realized, does not crave witnesses. It only needs courage in the moment it's asked for. She closed her door gently and rested her back against it, eyes lifting toward the ceiling. The future no longer felt like something she had to brace for. Whatever came next, she had already proven to herself who she was when it mattered. And in that certainty, she found peace. Because kindness is never wasted. It never disappears. It only waits until the world is ready to return it. If you believe that God can make a nobody to become a respected person in the society, comment, like, and subscribe on this channel for another interesting video.